Medical innovation starts with medical discussion. Talking about the future and what comes next with Project Medtech.
But Napoli just went up 4-0.
Yeah.
Anyways, thanks everyone for tuning in to another happy hour. Sponsors for this one are Nagel Medtech, Will's down here in one of the corners waving, and then also Rook Quality System, who's our special guest this week. Both of which will be at our startup symposium in October, and both are on separate panels. Gary will be at the startup symposium as well, presenting. So anyways, if you're interested in attending another event, we have a startup symposium October 6th and 7th in Houston, Texas. We're probably have like 5 or 6 tickets left as of right now. We're looking at opening up 25 more, but right now we're at like 94 attendees with a max 125.
Congratulations.
So, yeah, thank you. Yeah. So we're pretty happy about that. But with that being said, Kyle Rose is the founder, president of Rook Quality System, RQS. They're a sponsor of the podcast as well. And with that being said, this topic is really about right sizing your quality system. And so this is like a common topic we see with startup companies, small companies, medtech companies of all sizes, right? Is how do you build something that, you know, the common thing is like, is it going to hinder our growth? Is it going to hinder production? Is it going to hinder design? That kind of thing. So ask Kyle to come in and talk about it. So with that being said, Kyle, it's all you.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Dwayne. And thanks everybody for joining. Kind of the right sizing is really the reason I started Rook. So my background, I had originally studied chemistry and biology, went to a small school in South Georgia called Georgia Southern. From there, started working in manufacturing at a diagnostic company. There, they had just gone through some FDA audits, needed some support. So I kind of went from manufacturing and helped on the quality side, and really took the mindset of how can we make this more efficient if we're filling out these forms, what can we do to make sure people are actually completing them on time, completing them properly, and not having all those tiny little documentation errors and all the things that can get you minor findings, things like that at audits. And as I went to work at bigger companies and smaller companies, really saw that is a big issue, is a lot of companies have quality systems that are cumbersome, hard to get things done, months and months to get simple forms completed, or validations that just sit on people's desks for weeks, months, any of that thing. And even the smallest things can take a long time. So my kind of thought and approach was there has to be a way to make this more efficient, to kind of relook at the standards and see what we can do to help these types of companies that are going through it the first time, or have a quality system and really want to make it more usable, more efficient, all that stuff. So with that mindset, I started doing some consulting part-time with some startups in the Atlanta area. And from there, kind of branched out in the Southeast, some in Memphis, some in Houston, and then continue to grow Rook. So we've now around 30 quality engineers and over 150 different clients that we support. But that mindset of really trying to make the QMS the right size, efficient for all types of companies has been our main bread and butter the entire time. So whether that's a one-person startup or that is a Fortune 500 company, there's ways that we can help to improve efficiency, help to reduce the documentation burden for these types of companies. And that's our mindset for our whole company. So this right sizing the QMS is definitely something that we're passionate about and eager to talk more about. I think there's lots of ways that you can do it, whether that's from the high level procedural side and how you comply with the standards, or, you know, if you're making your day-to-day work instructions that you're completing for manufacturing or batch release or anything like that. I think there's a lot of ways to do that, both on the documentation side, other tools with eQMS and things like that you can leverage as well. I'll kind of open it up, see if anybody has any early questions. If not, we can talk a little bit more about some ways we've seen companies be successful with this process as well.
I'll take an early one.
Yeah.
When, and this is because of the stage of companies, you know, we work with at Project Medtech, but at what point does someone need to start designing a quality system, or at least having some of those things in place. I think that's just like the where a lot of startups struggle is they're like, oh, I need a quality system. And it's like, well, you do, but that could just be a simple spreadsheet, right? I mean, for some people at certain stage, I'm just curious, like at what point do you start having some of these things so that you don't get behind the 8 ball?
Yeah, I think that's a question we get a lot as well. I think our approach is to use a pre-market quality system. So we focus really on the activities that you're going to need to do in the pre-market development phase. Key aspects of that would be a high-level document control procedure, a high-level design control procedure as you're designing the product. Risk management is part of this process. So as you're developing, you also want to look at the risks and how that relates to your testing. And then supplier assessment being another key one that you want to have as well. A lot of times these startups have suppliers that are providing services, whether that's design or manufacturing or things like that. So you want to make sure that you have agreements and controls over your suppliers for the products and services that they provide. As far as actually when to dive into the DHF, we've seen it done a few different ways. We've seen companies start very early in early ideation of the product and say, hey, we want to define these requirements, these are your needs, and kind of move it along as we go. This is typically how bigger companies do it. They won't start big projects without some of this initial documentation. I still think that's useful for startups as well. It doesn't take a ton of time and effort, but I think it can be done that way. If you're more on the side of, we like R&D and we don't like to document and it's slowing us down, I typically say the kind of the version of the device before your design freeze is the last time you can kind of start your design history file. So as you're getting closer to, we know this is the product and we're going to start testing it, that kind of version or iteration right before that is when you really want to nail down all your user needs, your design inputs, and really make sure you have a strong plan for your testing, your materials, your risks that are going to be involved, so that you don't miss anything. The big risk is, oh, we didn't realize that we have to do electrical safety testing or biocompatibility testing or some type of testing that's going to take 6 months for us to complete. And now let's push back all of our timelines, everything we've told our investors, and now we're losing time, losing money, all of those things. So very key to have a solid plan on kind of the quality. It ties a little bit to the regulatory stuff as well, to make sure you're defining requirements, your risk, at one of those two stages, either all the way through, I think is super helpful. And that's what I would recommend. If you want to push it off as long as you can, it's kind of right before that design freeze timeline.
Perfect. You brought up another thing too. Oh, go ahead, Bill.
Yes, well, that's a question. So I'm a corporate lawyer and I do a fair amount of, M&A with, companies, device companies being acquired. And I'm just wondering, when you're designing a QA, program for a company, are you taking into account how easy it is to transition once a company gets acquired into an acquirer's quality program? Is that an issue?
I think from our experience, and we have a lot of companies we've helped with this process, help with the evaluation, help them transition into the acquirer's QMS. I think the approach is still to keep it lean. Obviously, the startup's going to be a lot leaner than the acquiring company. So we want to keep it lean, but also do want to keep it compliant. So making sure you do have the quality system and all the DHF activities in place. When it gets to time to merge it, we've seen that kind of the bigger company will sometimes swallow it whole and merge it that way. Or we've also seen that they'll let the smaller company, if they have a sound quality system and it's efficient and they're able to design products quickly, they'll let them work in that kind of separate QMS for additional time, right? And allow them to stay nimble and still developing while the bigger acquiring company maintains their separate. I think there's different ways it can be approached, but our goal of trying to keep it efficient and trying to keep it compliant, I think works for any situation when you're getting acquired. It definitely is a key point to focus on, is that when the acquirer comes to look at your QMS and design history file and testing and validation, they're going to do a deeper dive than the FDA or your ISO or MDR auditor. So it's their money, it's their time, it's their resources they're investing into this company and product. And they know more than anybody what happens if they don't have it in place, and how much additional time and money it'll take them, right? And we've seen deals that have been killed because of this. We've seen valuations that have been slashed because of these issues, and similar seen products that just didn't make it because they didn't invest in the quality documentation, the testing, the planning early on. So definitely think it's critical for that reason as well. And that's one thing that a lot of companies don't understand, is that, oh, we're doing as much as we can on the marketing side and putting out a good, presentation to the internet and all this stuff. But the back end of really the documentation and the foundation and the testing validation is what your potential acquirer is going to look at the most. So really have to have all that buttoned up. And so that's kind of, the earlier you start, the better, in my opinion as well.
Yeah, to pile onto this, because and Bill, I'm curious on your perspective as well, because you're part of a lot of these deals. But we had seen this maybe 3 or 4 years ago, where strategics were really digging into quality systems and kind of cutting down valuations, right, on some of these deals, because the quality system was going to be a lot of work. And it's always this trickle down effect, where now all of a sudden VCs are digging in before investments into quality systems a little bit, right? And it's not as sophisticated, but they're almost asking that question, it's showing up on their checklist of due diligence of, well, hey, how's your quality system? With this quality person, we don't have to take a look at it. So I'm curious, Bill, in your world, has that happened where all of a sudden, a valuation of a company has been slashed during a deal because their quality system wasn't up to snuff? Or have you seen any of that?
Not in any of the deals that I've worked on, but I don't necessarily have, the breadth and depth of that.
Yeah.
And I suspect there's probably a lot of angst behind the scenes that, that lawyers aren't going to see. But they're real issues. And I think that your comment about, VC investors being interested, just, sort of, not necessarily, lifting up the hood, but, peeking a little bit, is based on their experience with exits, as well as being, medical device entrepreneurs themselves, thinking, and maybe some of the times, actually knowing that they know more, than the team itself. So it's, any excuse that people can find to lower the valuation, they tend to go for. I always like to be able to say, there's nothing to see here, move to someone else's department.
Yeah, that's a good point. Anything they can do to lower the valuation, they will. I like that. I'll remember that for telling this to clients in the future as well. It's definitely something we've preached for a while, and we're going through a few right now with our clients that, we built their QMS, updated it, maintained it, and now are in that phase of trying to merge it into a bigger company's QMS and decide kind of how that gets done, what the key timelines are, things like that as well. On that topic, kind of also aligns with, do you build your QMS or your product to get acquired, or do you kind of just build it to go all the way through? We're always recommending that the companies build their product and their design that they're going to have to take it through, whether that's 510K or product launch or whatever that might be. Same idea that you never know when the acquirer is going to come, if they'll come. Even if you have a strategic relationship early on, we've seen that it still makes sense to assume you're going to do all of the testing, you're going to do all of the validation work, and then potentially somebody will pick it up along the way. But really, build your QMS, build your DHF in the mindset that you're going to have to do all the testing. You're going to have to take it through, because we've seen a lot of those deals, whether that's, an unforeseen pandemic or something just pops up and now nobody's, buying products, right? And you have to keep moving it forward. So that same idea is a lot of the same thing that we see companies ask, should we plan it to align with their quality system or their whatever, do it make sense for your company to move it through as compliant and quickly as you can, and then see what relationships you have along the way.
What about if you're using a contract manufacturer and they tell you they're ISO 13485 certified, we have our own quality system you can take care of, do you have to own that internally as well?
Yeah, I think There's still stuff you have to have in your quality system as well.
Right.
So a lot of times you can use the contract manufacturer to support your design history file. They can do a lot of the supplier and sourcing stuff as well. But it's still, you have the regulatory responsibility with the FDA or notified body, whatever it might be, for the products. You still have to have your high level quality system that shows how you have control over your suppliers, how you have authorized them either through your quality agreement or vetted them through audits or their review of their ISO certificate to make sure that they can meet your requirements, right? So the FDA is going to come to you first and say, hey, where is your agreement with this contract manufacturer? And where does it say that they are responsible for the DHF for the risk? And where are you signing off on that? That is one thing that we've seen a lot more scrutiny in audits with, whether it's ISO or MedSAP or MDR, is those agreements between the startup company, virtual company, and the contract manufacturer. That's a big focus on MedSAP and is kind of tied down to all the other regulations as well. Really identifying that you have those sound quality agreements, they meet all their regulations that you're kind of considering for your QMS, and that roles and responsibilities are tied to that. That quality agreement's a good starting point, but then also as you get into like design transfer documentation and making sure it's very clearly identified who signs off on what, who's responsible for what design changes and updates to procedures and records and drawings, all that type of stuff is critical with those relationships as well. A lot of times people assume that just because they have 1345, they're good at manufacturing. That's not always the case either. 1345 is related to your quality system and your paperwork. There's also a lot of manufacturing stuff that's required as well. So we always recommend that you go on site and do an audit as they are manufacturing your product to make sure that they're doing it to your specification. There's a lot of stuff that can be lost in translation when you're transferring a product you've iterated on and developed in-house for years and years. And then you just send it to somebody and expect them to be able to make it the same way in a few months. That's very rarely the case in our experience. So having that hands-on audit procedure, and really this ties back to your requirements. If you have really strong requirements on your user needs, your inputs, your potential work instructions you developed along the way, it's a lot easier to transition that information to your contract manufacturer, give them a leg up, even though they might be using different equipment, and hopefully it's faster, more automated, higher volume stuff. Still having kind of all the rationale on why you do it this way and the procedures in place definitely helps ease that transfer process to a new contract manufacturer.
Cool. So that ISO 1345 certification for like groups like, I mean, this is a good example, right? Like NagelMed or Nagel Medtech, sorry. If they have ISO 1345, does that, I mean, that has to, I get they have to do more than that, right? But it still means something, right? It makes your life a little bit easier knowing that they have that certification.
Definitely. Yeah. Definitely having, a 1345 contract manufacturer is preferred, right? That's ideal. Okay. That's specifically for med device. And ideally everybody would have that. Okay. We do occasionally, get companies that say, hey, they just have 9001 or they don't have a quality system. Is that something we can still use as supplier? And you will see whether it's X-ray systems or other specialized product that are from other industries and can be crossed over into med device, that this happens quite a bit where their suppliers don't have a quality system or don't have 9001 or don't have 1345. Those suppliers can still be used. It's really that you have to take risk from the supplier and bring it back to yourself, whether that's doing additional testing when you receive the product.
More like controls, right?
Exactly. So you either have to help set up the work instructions and the procedures at their facility, or when you receive that product or whoever else receives that component or product from them, you do additional testing and you have higher rates of sampling when you receive that product. So you are kind of removing the risk from the supplier because they don't have the qualification certifications, and putting that back on yourself to say, hey, we know they don't have a quality system. it just happens that this type of thing is not required in their industry, but we want to use it for our med device scope. So we're going to do additional testing. We're going to make sure it works for our product through incoming inspection and QC and final validation. All of these things show that this product can be safe and effective and meet our requirements, and that's fine as well. So it's not going to happen that every single supplier has 1345 through your whole product line and bill of materials, but there are ways to remove risk from your suppliers and put it back on yourself.
Okay. I have two other things, but they're different subjects. So is there more you wanted to cover, Kyle, before I ask a few others?
I think the same idea. There's definitely ways to keep this efficient. So Rook typically uses like a survey first just to see where the suppliers are at. And then we have a quality agreement that we implement as well. And then the audits, like I said, the audits are a good idea and definitely want to do those once they're manufacturing. Audits are not always mandatory, and especially for startups, it might be a bigger cost, things like that. So you can do remote audits. You can kind of outsource an audit to a consulting firm or something like that to go do it for you. I think are ways to kind of improve that process, make it more efficient. The bigger companies will say, oh, we got to audit every supplier every year, things like that. That's not always realistic for a startup. So there are ways to make this supplier assessment, evaluation, approval process more efficient. And so taking that same approach on how to right size this process, how to have a risk-based approach to this process makes sense as well. So the critical suppliers that are giving you the key to your device and what makes it work, we want more documentation on them. The ones that are an off-the-shelf product that everybody uses and nobody has issues with, might not need as much documentation. So using that right size risk-based approach is definitely something we preach and advise and have had success with in audits as well.
Great. What about so I'll come back to ISO 1345 in a second, but what about like EQMSs, right? Like the green lights of the world, the Qualios of the world. I guess, like a lot of time, we spend a lot of time too talking with our startups like, okay, well, when is it time to use that, right? Can you build your own, right? Like, I think that's like another mystery for a lot of startup companies getting into this is how does that, what's the synergy with my quality consultant, right? I don't know. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of high level, the way we best describe it is the EQMS is the QuickBooks, and the consultants are kind of the accountant that goes in, make sure all the right information's there, making sure the numbers are in place when you send it to the IRS, and making sure you're compliant with all your dates and payments and stuff like that. So that's a kind of, everybody pays their taxes. It's a well-known type idea, but that's kind of the idea. Just having the QuickBooks by itself or the EQMS is not going to get you to pass your audits. You still need somebody in there that knows what they're doing, knows how to get the reports in place, the right documentation, have it completed, all that stuff. So EQMS are great tools. We use them. It's made our job a lot easier. I'm able to work with companies in Ireland and Taiwan and everything from my desk, right? So it's easy for me to jump into somebody's quality system and sign off on documents, approve things like that. I think it is on the startup side, deciding whether or not to use an EQMS. It's a lot of time and cost, right? If you have the money and you have the urgency to move this product forward and it's going to meet this milestone in the next 6 months, year, I think jump in. If you think you're going to use it in the next year, I always say go ahead and spring for it now and just go ahead and build things out. But there's definitely ways to do it without an EQMS. We have companies that use a Dropbox, a Google Drive, something like that. Rook personally has a Part 11 compliant DocuSign that we let all of our clients use. So anything that they do need signed, we send it to them and they sign electronically. Signing and scanning and stuff like that is not super efficient, so not the best, but there are ways to sign and maintain it, and then eventually you can transition to an EQMS as well. The homegrown systems, I'm not a huge fan of. I think it ends up costing more money and more time than just getting an off-the-shelf EQMS solution. We've seen a few companies that have been successful, but the majority of them have spent a lot of time to develop their own systems, and they're maintaining them, then they're validating them, or bringing us in to validate them, and it ends up being a lot more work than just using an off-the-shelf system. The validation side is definitely something to consider as well when you are looking at EQMS. Part of the requirements say you need to validate these tools for their use. So making sure that when you do evaluate them, you look at ones that provide validation support. Sometimes that's like a hidden cost that the validation is not part of the package or part of the scope. So you have to go back and pay for that. So making sure that when you are evaluating EQMS, you consider the validation side as well. That also applies to other tools that companies use. If you're using a CRM tool for management of customer feedback and customer relationship stuff, that's something that will eventually need to be validated. Same with like any of your ERP tools or things like that. We'll have to look at validation scope as well. So all of these electronic tools that touch your data, your records, things like that, could be part of your validation scope. So making sure if this is something you just seen, oh, we've done it for this other industry, we were a software device previously, and now we're getting into SAMD, we can keep using the same tools. You also have to look at the validation scope for all these tools as well. So making sure you plan for that as well.
No kidding. I really wasn't aware of the CRM piece.
Yeah.
I figured the ERP piece, but not that. Okay. Kyle, what about?
I'll say, on CRM, there's some planning involved too, right? So you'll see CRMs that have default settings and say, oh, this is a complaint, this is whatever. Well, their definition of complaint is probably not the same as the FDA's definition of complaint. So even when you're setting up these CRM tools, you're going to be very careful on the terms that you use and not flagging every single inbound question on, FAQ type thing as a complaint. Can be very bad when the FDA shows up and sees you have 300 complaints and you haven't investigated any of them. So there's a lot of setup and planning tied to these CRM tools as well, that if you're not familiar with how it ties to the regulations and stuff like that, can be unknown hurdle as well that we've seen some companies trip up on as well.
Okay, that's super helpful. One other question, then I'll shut up for a little while. So I just edited a podcast that'll be released next Monday. It's about the whole history of the EU MDR. The guy's name is Rob Packard, if you know who that is. He runs the Medical Device Academy or something. Yeah. Anyways, he was with BSI in 2012. And so he did this whole background about when the EU MDR started rolling out. Well, then we got into post-market surveillance. And then that's when we brought up, well, hey, all this stuff's happening in Europe. No one thought that would ever happen there. What about if the FDA started getting into more of a post-market surveillance type of world as well? Because right now they require none, right? And so then we talked about ISO 13485, and that's when you brought up the fact that within ISO 13485, I believe it would give the FDA some type of grounds to stand on to require post-market surveillance data or something like this. I don't know if I'm even asking the question right, but just curious on your opinion with, now that the FDA they've officially kind of moved towards ISO 13485? Is that right?
So they've announced the plan for the QMSR, which is the quality system, quality management system regulations, which will be the merger between the current 21 CFR stuff and 1345. So that plan was put out earlier this year, and they're supposed to be collecting feedback from different parties, and people are submitting their questions and concerns, stuff like that. And then there's going to be a plan on actual implementation, and it's going to go through all the government processes and be put into law. So that, will probably happen later this year, early next year. And then there'll be a transition timeline of 3 to 5 years. I think some of the early comments were pushing more to the 5-year side of things. On the post-market surveillance side, I think there are FDA requirements for post-market that you do it, but it's very loosely interpreted. It's also not very well audited, right? So the post-market side on the FDA, audits are sporadic, they're not scheduled, they kind of do a risk-based approach. So, we've seen startups that haven't gotten audited in 5 or 6 years on the market. So I definitely think there is a gap with, the FDA compared to EU MDR and other just general ISO, as far as, companies can get a 510K, potentially not change much on the product and not update any testing and be able to sell that device for 20, 30 years and have very few audits and very few changes. So I think that is a risk. I think that is something that personally I would like to see get updated and FDA be more proactive with audits and the post-market surveillance side. I think we're still kind of seeing how it's going to shake out in MDR. It's very heavy on how much you need and how much clinical data you need and post-market clinical data. I think there's kind of a happy medium is where it'll fall into eventually. But I definitely think there's room for the FDA to improve how they handle post-market surveillance, improve how they audit it, and the frequency of these reviews and audits as well. The complaint and MDR process is pretty set, but whether that's having companies submit post-market data, submit every decade or 5 years, updated reports on how their device is performing, something like that, I think are definitely things that could be improved with the current FDA stuff. So, it'll be interesting to see how the QMSR changes that, if it does at all. I think there's definitely going to be updated auditor training. There's going to be a little bit tougher audit process. I've always said that I think it's going to be very similar to the MDSAP audit process, which already combines ISO and the 21 CFR. So, and which is very well documented and very clearly describes what the auditor needs to see for each section. It's only 240 pages, so there's a lot of information on what all you need to show and what all you need to do for your QMS. But I think that's going to be a lot closer to what the FDA wants in the future with their QMSR stuff. So we'll see. That's the fun part about being a consultant, is it's always changing, and we have to be the first ones to keep up with it and then help our clients kind of manage this stuff as well.
Yeah, it's helpful, right? It's something that we talk to a lot of people about, and it's changed the landscape of where startups go to market, right? I mean, it used to be Europe first, and then you come to the US, and now that's changed. Unless you're, a de novo or a PMA, maybe then you still look at the EU because you need data. But it's just something that's come up where people are like, well, the EU went that way, the US will never do that, and it's like, well, I don't know. I mean, the US, you don't have to have any. I mean, it's so little, like you said, right? It's just the things aren't in place, and sometimes it's scary. So anyways, does anyone else have any other questions? I know I've been asking a lot, but just trying to guide the conversation in a way that we kind of covered everything. Gary, I know you're kind of in the thick of everything, launching a product. Is there anything from your side?
No, I would just share with everyone that I just recently went through the process of analyzing and evaluating a number of different QMS type companies. And I just recently signed a contract with Kyle to help us get to where we need to be. And it was mainly because I was very impressed with, he put together a very legitimate roadmap to help me get to where we needed to be in a relatively good level of compliance. And I have no doubt that this will work out well. And Bill, your question about, how this might affect mergers or acquisitions, that was in the forefront of my mind, because with the company that I'm managing right now, we fully expect the most likely exit would be for us to be acquired if we're successful. So I've taken the approach that I don't think it really matters a great deal how the QMS system is developed, but it's tremendously important that it is there. My approach has always been, if you're going to try to be acquired, everything needs to be squeaky clean, and you have to assume they're going to take a real hard look at you and doing due diligence. So that's why I contracted with someone like Kyle now to make sure that we can start getting our house in order, so that we're always a little bit ahead of the curve.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Like,
Definitely. Yeah, I would say definitely, excited to start working with you, Gary. But yeah, same thing. It's making sure that everything's in place because they are going to look into it. They know all the common pitfalls and on where companies might skip corners and stuff like that. So
Yep.
definitely making sure that you have kind of somebody supporting you to get it in place. But then we also support our clients as they're going through the evaluations for the potential acquirer as well, right? So
Yep.
having somebody, we do the same with FDA audits, external audits. We'll be in the room or in the Zoom to help them kind of answer questions, get through the audit process, all of that type of stuff as well.
Yeah, and I'm a big proponent on doing mock audits that, have you or someone come in and take us through an audit. So if we're going to make mistakes, let's do it with the consultant and not with the FDA.
That's a good approach as well for our side, right? As the internal audit is, you want to catch it internally and be able to fix it before, you're looking like a deer in headlights when the FDA asks for a certain procedure or asks for, these records and you don't have them. That's the worst. So making sure that you catch it internally and you're doing that deeper dive on your internal audits and reviewing all the DHFs or all the CAPA files and just really making sure that there's no gaps before, that the auditor shows up.
Yep.
Yeah, once the bells go off at FDA, they're hard to unring bells.
Exactly. Yeah.
So Kevin, or I think it's Harishi, any questions from you all as well? I know you've been with us. I mean, I know pretty much everyone on this phone on the call pretty well, and so wanted to give you all some opportunities to ask questions if you had any.
Oh, nothing on my end. I actually just I just recently came on board working with Will at Nagel Medtech.
Great.
So it's just great to be able to listen in and learn about these happy hours. I love them. Yeah,
awesome. And Harishi?
Yeah, so I have 10 years of experience in med devices. Just quit my job and started my own startup a couple of months ago. And so this is particularly relevant for me to ask for help on when to start a QMS. Just wanted to get input from Kyle and Gary on what was, are there any particular EMSs EQMSs you'd recommend? And Gary, what was the result of your diligence on the different systems you evaluated? And which one did you end up picking?
Kyle's company is the one, Rook, that I signed a contract with. And from my perspective, he did the best job of kind of walking me through and explaining to me, all right, this is the process. This is what we're going to have to do. This is how we're going to get there.
I see.
Anytime you're involved with an early stage startup, cash flow is always a concern. And he also presented in a way that, look, there are a lot of variables here. This is the minimum it's going to cost you. This is what I think the maximum will be. And, more than likely it's going to fall somewhere in between those two. But that was very helpful to me because that allowed me to really have a very real world look at the likely impact it would have on my cash flow, where some of the other proposals I looked at just said X amount for this phase, X amount for this phase, plus $250 an hour for additional follow-up work and things like that. Well, that could mushroom into, a significant amount of money depending on where you were. So for me, I tend to be a very practical person, and I understood his quote. I understood how it would help us get to a reasonably good level of compliance. And that's what I'm looking for right now. We're not big enough and don't have the deep enough pockets to know that everything's going to be 100% perfect, but I need to get to a point where I have what anyone would consider a reasonable level of compliance for our stage in our development. And that's why Kyle got the contract.
Thank you, Gary. So Kyle, in terms of the EQMS, do you recommend a particular one, or are there some you and your team are more familiar with?
I think it really depends on the product. We use Greenlight the most, and that's typically the easiest one. It's not customizable or configurable, which means it's really easy to start using out of the box and get up to speed with kind of the ease of use. Like there's very little like training transition period for the companies that use it. There are other tools depending on your type of product that could be a better fit, right? So we've done, major evaluation projects for Fortune 500 companies that cover every EQMS tool, pros and cons, and stuff like that. So what do you have any idea kind of what your product is, software versus needing a bill of material that works, any of that type of stuff, I think would help us kind of tailor our recommendation as well. I think some other key ones that we see people use, Enzyme is good, offers more configuration, is good for software products. If you're looking for more just like a bare bones and don't want as much of your DHF in there, we see a lot of companies use Zen QMS, which allows for like document control and training, stuff like that. Qualio is good as well. We've used that a little bit. Matrix Requirements is one out of Germany that we liked that's more tailored for software products, and is pretty easy to use and configure as well. A little bit more customization for certain features if you are doing a software product. But I think it really depends on your type of device.
Yes. But for hardware, Greenlight is a good place to start.
Greenlight's great for hardware. I think the same. Qualio and Enzyme would do good as well. I think Greenlight's, the software is great. They're consistently putting new updates out, and they have a great customer success team that's able to answer questions, stuff like that. So I think that's one of the big advantages. Like I talked about earlier, the validation burden, they provide a validation packet, so you just have to kind of complete it. Typically takes a few hours. So whereas some bigger ones, the validation side might be additional $10,000-$15,000 on top of the software, depending on how you configure it. So really depends. There's some that are tied to Salesforce that we've seen companies like a lot as well. If you use Salesforce for other activities, that could be an easy add-on, is to get like a Compliance Quest or Propel or two that are popular within the Salesforce platform that we've seen people like as well.
Thank you, Carl.
But yeah, definitely feel free to follow up with any questions, that we can kind of chat through some of our experience with that as well.
Yeah, it's actually, let me do this real quick. Kyle, is it okay if I drop your email
Sure.
in the chat? There we go.
But yeah, the EQMS just in general, it kind of cleans up a lot of the stuff as far as like, you always have the latest version of the documents. You have to have people sign off before you release stuff. So some of the things that on a document control side that can be gaps, if you're doing it for the first time, EQMS typically reduces that risk, right? So you're not releasing documents without signatures, you're not using old versions of procedures or drawings, things like that, which is one of the things that can catch people up if they don't have a diligent doc control person, and a lot of times EQMS streamlines that process.
Awesome. So no one else has any questions. We can wrap up here. I dropped Kyle's email into the chat. I will be posting this recording sometime this week. So it's on our YouTube channel. We'll post it on LinkedIn so you can kind of share it. But and within there, people can go back, and I think we recorded the VC one, and if you missed the healthcare reimbursement one from last week, or not last week, but last month, that was a really solid one. And Nick made reimbursement actually somewhat like enjoyable, which is sometimes hard to do. But he was very his comedy was up my alley, right? So anyways, I was pretty sarcastic, which was funny. But anyways, so that was a good one to check out as well. So those are all on there from here on out, so you can go back and watch some of these. Kyle's also done maybe 1 or 2 episodes of the podcast. You've done one, and Andrew Wu, who runs your Taiwan group.
Branch, yep.
Yeah. Yeah, so he's been on the podcast as well and talked about similar things. But with that being said, as always, we're always here to answer any questions. Go to projectmedtech.com, reach out to us, whatever it is. Thanks to our sponsors, Nagel Medtech and Rook Quality System. And Kyle, thank you for your time and answering our questions and doing this. And yeah, I think sometimes these informal settings are really, really nice. So we appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks again, Dwayne, for
Yeah, thank you so much.
hosting. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye.